Hey everyone, it's 12:30, so we're going to start. I'm Liz Hume. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and I am so happy to introduce these two amazing people. I unfortunately accidentally got double booked, so I have to go to another session, but I'm going to leave you in excellent hands. This topic, our brains on conflict in the neuroscience, Tim and Mari can tell you, I am fascinated by it. It is such incredible research. It is so needed in our field. I think it's going to be, it's a big gap in our field. And these two people, Mari Fitzduff, who was at Brandeis forever in their conflict center. She has just retired, but not retired. She's in Northern Ireland and has just done this incredible book. Please buy it and get it and read it. I keep going back to it. It's phenomenal. Our Brains on Conflict, and it's really easy to read for someone who isn't a scientist or a neuroscientist. That's what I love about it. It's so practical and so important on how you can apply it. So Mari is also a senior fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. We love Mari. She's just a great asset to the peacebuilding field. We're so grateful for her. Tim Phillips, CEO and founder of Beyond Conflict, an organization that is just at the cutting edge and innovative and pushing all of this forward in a very practical way as well. And Tim also, whatever I talk to Tim, I can understand it. So that's what's great about it as well. You're speaking the language, and I'm so grateful for both of you. I'm going to hop off. I'm leaving everyone in really great hands, and I can't wait to see the recording.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Liz. And maybe I'll just say a couple of words and want to welcome my very good and distinguished friend, Mari Fitzduff. Mari, I know we've been doing this work for a long time. When I think I met you in 1992 or 3 in Belfast. And when Beyond Conflict started doing work in Northern Ireland in the early 90s, you were one of the key people we consulted with and have kept in touch over the years. And this book you did is really important and really cutting edge. And I want to thank you both personally and sort of for the field for this major contribution. And one of the key things I just want to say before turning it over to you to really give this presentation, and then we'll go into some questions and then open up to the audience and try to have a conversation, is you bring a lot of credibility as a scholar in the field of conflict resolution and reconciliation, but also a practitioner, having held some key positions in Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles, or at particularly the period trying to resolve the conflict. So you bring both a scholar practitioner lens to this book and to this work, and it gives real credibility to the book and to the embracing of what you're talking about in this book, because you have both a scholarly and a practitioner background. And that's very important and very exciting. So I'm privileged to be here with you and very much look forward to this conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation, and then we'll go to the conversation.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Liz for welcoming to giving me the slot. I know we've spoken often about this book, and I think we jointly see its importance, but I also think that I have a lot owing to Tim. Tim Phillips was the inspiration for much of this work. We have come and gone a little on how we could do it. And I was lucky enough just to have the time. Once I had sort of a bit of space and time, I was able to put that together. But a lot of the impetus for this and a lot of the best research was actually done through Tim's Institute Beyond Violence, and particularly the work you did with the MIT. So I'm delighted to be with you. Okay,
thank you,
folks, since I gather that many of you have not, I would presume that many of you haven't actually read the book. Get it in your library if you can. I'd like to start by introducing you to it. Now, Megan, I am pressing playlist and nothing has come up where I had my slides. Is there something I should do to make these come up? Here we are. Okay. So this is basically the cover for the book. Oh, yes, here we are. People have often asked me why I did this. As Tim said, I worked in Northern Ireland for about 15 years. And my first introduction to it was living in an area where there was 30 people murdered in my own area. There were paramilitaries, there were soldiers, etc., etc. And also trying to think what could be done. And one of the things that I started to think about was a field that nobody knew about really in Northern Ireland. And this was in the late 80s. And I thought about the field of mediation. And I remember going to one of the universities and saying, would you like, I'll run a course on this. Half the people who turned up for the course turned up for meditation because they had never actually heard the term mediation. So that is how new we were in the field. Also, I was appointed to a fairly substantial role in the Community Relations Council, which was funding a lot of the conflict resolution work. But I had to ask some big questions about the kind of work they were doing. And this was because things that had struck me even before I took up that job. So here I was living in an area that was full of conflict. In the early 70s was just unbelievably awful. We had bombs going off every day. We had nearly 1,000 people killed. It was a hugely awful year for Northern Ireland. And the questions that were for me was, how come we have fallen apart as we have? Some of you may get to see the film Belfast. And that's very interesting because it's about the first stirrings of conflict on a Protestant community in Belfast. And I think they've done it marvelously well, where you had a few people who fell into the old histories, fell into the old hates, and others who were trying desperately to find a positive way to deal with the hate that was arising. The other thing was I had done my PhD on paramilitaries. And one of the things that struck me, and I have this in the first chapter of the book, was many of the paramilitaries I met were actually what we would call ordinary, decent people, that when they weren't out killing or trying to kill people from the other side, they were helping their own communities, looking after the children, teaching sport, helping the grannies, etc. And how did I figure this kind of person could have both the horrific aspects of their personality, where they would kill people from the other side, and then the positive sides where for their own community, they were infinitely helpful. So these were the questions that I was asking. Why does conflict erupt so easily? Why are so many people willing to kill and be killed for an identity, a cartoon, or a flag? And we can remember what happened in Denmark some years ago. Why, and I have written another book on why people follow leaders. Why are people so drawn to strong leaders as opposed to wise leaders? And also to one we all struggle with. Why do facts actually matter so little in conflicts? Those of you who had conversations with neighbors and friends in terms of the facts of what's happening in the world may have found, as I did, that in fact many of them found it very difficult to actually agree on facts. Okay, the other thing that has struck me very much was living through both the Brexit campaign and the Trump campaign. They were happening at the same time. And what was quite obvious to us that in both of those campaigns, the leaders appealed emotionally to people's instinct and predispositions. And Brexit, as Foster has said, it was dominated not by evidence-based reason, like who would be better off, economically would we be better off, but by hysteria, hatred, savage emotions, and the sinister monster of exclusionary ethnic nationalism. So I suggest that the answer to that, if you look at one of the pictures of some of Trump's meetings, which were fascinating to watch, basically there was a feeling of people being together. There was a feeling of having found a savior. They didn't really want to know the details. Whenever he started to talk about policies, because his followers, his wise men and women had every so often said to him, talk about policies, people had actually walked out. They weren't really interested in the nitty-gritty of what he was actually talking about. What they wanted was the feeling of being with him and the feeling that he gave them. Now, the problem is, how do you deal with this if feeling is such a predominant mode in our politics today? If you look at some of you have probably studied international politics, I imagine, or indeed even politics. You know, you don't get to talk about feelings. You get to talk about power, and you get to talk about military worth. You get to talk about how much people have both military and economic power and sanctioning power, etc. What you don't get to talk about is emotions. But however, the new wars that most of us are likely to be involved in, about 98% of them, are all about internal conflict, identity, inequalities, and exclusions. So those of you who have tried to argue, as I have, with a Brexiteer or a Trump supporter or an ISIL suicide bomber will have discovered that, in fact, the whole question of rational dialogue doesn't figure very highly. I mean, I would even say we should take this into account in terms of our international wars. I'm conscious at the moment that we're talking about Putin and what might happen in Ukraine. And that, of course, is quite frightening. But I also think that if you go back far enough into where Putin has come from, a lot of that was actually about feelings and his feeling of being excluded and not being taken seriously when the Soviet Union fell apart. So I began to look at what we call now the neurosciences, and they're many and varied. One of the interesting and difficult things about the work was trying to navigate through these various new sciences that are emerging and actually begin to affect a lot of people and a lot of disciplines. For instance, those of you who've done economics will know that economics has taken into account a lot of neuroscience, because basically in economics, the market is actually interested in selling more things to more people, and neuroscience can help on that. And you'll note there, I have noted that the beginnings lay, I think, in MIT and in Tim's own particular organization called Beyond Conflict. The GMU have now set up an organization dealing with it, and the University of Pennsylvania is still working quite hard at this. So it's good to see that people are beginning to take it seriously. We couldn't have done this unless we had new tools. We had, before this, as social scientists, we would ask people what they thought, what they felt, etc., and take it at face value. But in fact, the advent of some of these tools was really useful. For instance, take the fact that pretty well most of your friends will say they're not prejudiced, they don't notice color. But just put them in front of an fMRI and you will notice what happens, and there's a startled response. They often will notice people who are different, unless they've got used to living among people who are different, and therefore their anxiety is actually diminished somewhat. The whole question of genetic and hormonal testing and what that's told us about personalities. And the best thing that they gave us was the fact that there's now no cheating that we can do in terms of our feelings. And I would say it's good that we now can be honest with each other. So I just see. I seem to have lost my. Oh, okay. Sorry, folks. Okay. So what are these instincts and genes that I'm talking about? It's fascinating because you will find that there's a distinct correlation to many of our feelings. And actually, being men and women, we would know that even if you're talking about hormones, show me a woman who says she's not at all affected by her menstrual cycle. And as for young men in terms of testosterone, how men have struggled with their testosterone. So already we have made it known to us that our bodies are very affected by such things. And indeed, even I was struck by some evidence recently where it showed that if a judge gave you a sentence, if he gave it to you just after lunchtime, he was likely to be more lenient than he waited a few hours and got a bit hungry, and then he was likely to give a harder one. So I think the whole thing of it's hard for us not to deny. It's hard for us to deny that these things don't actually affect us. The interesting things is that we also differ in how our bodies respond. For instance, I don't know if any of you have had children, but I'm very conscious that many of us are in favor of the blank slate theory. In other words, that children, they come with a blank slate, and we as parents, we have the joy and the delight and the challenge of fostering their views. But the reality is most of our children are born different. And one of the ways in which they differ is their response to uncertainty and to fear and to strangers. For instance, some of your children are more worried about strangers, others are less worried. And that's because conservatives, by and large, have a larger amygdala structure as opposed to a smaller one where they're not so strained, as it were, by meeting novelty. But people with another gene variant, which affects dopamine, are more likely to be open-minded people. And I think the fact is that this will mean that you get people to whom you can do the work are probably more open to the work you're trying to do in peace building than others. And that, of course, is one of the big lessons, that in fact, what you face are people who are very different often in terms of their personality. And of course, as you already know by now, the people that come forward to do the peace building are often the people who are more open, whereas those who are more conservative, more fearful of change are likely to be those who have a larger amygdala and who are resistant to change. And as I say, we're very different in the way we respond. One of the things that's very useful is to recognize that, I often have a class of people coming from, a third of them would come from the United States. And when you ask them where their parents would eat as opposed to where they would eat, they, for instance, were into Thai food and Japanese food, etc. Whereas previous generations and their own parents, of course, would very much be into the more normal restaurants and not understand why their children were novelty seeking, as it were, in terms of the choices that they made. This is one of the fascinating slides. If any of you are interested in carrying them, I have to warn you that there were 72 pages of references when I had finished my work. I was appalled and horrified, but that was for a very good reason, because some of this work is so startling that I really wanted to feel it was wedged, it was anchored in good science. This was a piece of slide that I came across about a couple of years into my work, which actually claims that you can look at every different thing that people think about politics, sexuality, gender, etc., and see how much of it comes from their genomes, how much of it comes from their environment, and how much of it comes from their family circumstances, etc. So in a way, we're already talking about a whole pool of people who are predisposed or not predisposed to either conflict or peacekeeping. And the reason we have people who are different is not because one or the other is better. And I really want to emphasize this. I can remember being in Bellagio. It's a conference center run by the Rockefellers. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's a beautiful place to go to. And I can remember somebody come up and talking to me about my two sons. And I said, it's interesting, one of them is very sort of, he will be out there. He's trying to change the world. The other is more cautious. He's sort of thinking of different things. And I immediately said, the world needs both of them. Because those who are proposed to go and chase after the tigers, as opposed to those who say, hold on, the spoor is fresh, we have to be careful, are both needed. Now, the reality is that in many of us who are in the field see ourselves as liberal. But I would say to you that one of the reasons you are probably liberal is that you have a society where it's easier to be liberal in. In other words, societies that are safer, societies that are ordered, the societies that value diversity and openness are much more likely to have people who are liberal in them because they feel safer in doing so. Now, one of the pieces of science is the whole question of the mirror neurons, and this involves the piece of work that Tim did, where it was discovered that if you bring groups together, mostly we get to know other people through our mirror neurons. We don't sit and think about them or even talk about them. There's something happens between our physical mirror neurons. And it means we can often connect with people, or it means we often disconnect with people, particularly people who are not from our own tribe. And it's so much easier if you have that kind of empathy happening. Now, this is really important because there are ways in which that empathy can actually be changed and emphasized and helped. And if you're doing mediation, as I am and a lot of my colleagues are, then you really need to know about how you can facilitate the whole quality of knowing others through the mirror neurons. This is helped by the whole oxytocin hormone. This is a hormone that makes us feel good about each other. If you ever watch a team, for instance, who are playing together, particularly a male team, testosterone and the oxytocin hormones are often what get them to play so well together. And then, of course, they also help them to want to kick the life out of the other side as well, because they're also ready to, because they are bonding with each other, they want to kill as it were, on the football field or the rugby field, the other side. So the whole question of oxytocin is something that we need to take very seriously, because, again, it is the way in which we begin to know each other and get to like each other. Tim's work was some of the most fascinating of this, where they were taking people who were from different groups. For instance, it could be Israeli Palestinians, or I think it was Mexicans, USA, but I have found it to be the same in South Africa, black and white, in Northern Ireland, Protestants, Catholics, etc. So where you have a group that seemingly has more power over the other, where people are looking at others and seeing that they have power over them, that's actually very hard for people who don't have power to empathize with people who are the power people. Whereas the power people, when they're in a room with people who are different to them and they are feeling liberal and they are liberal, they can often feel empathy for what Palestinians are feeling and for what Catholics were feeling a few decades ago, what blacks were feeling in South Africa, etc. Whereas those groups who are in a minority only feel empathy for the other group when they feel they're listening to them. Now, this has really a huge amount of importance for our work. One of the big challenges you'll find when you go to this work is the whole question of structural work and inequalities. And I would say that, you have to understand that if you are trying to take and help people assist them through a peace process, you have to take structural work very seriously. And there is evidence, for instance, that we feel unfairness in our body. But there's also evidence, very clear evidence, that a group who are feeling left out, who actually belong to a particular identity, and then who have a leader who will lead them, often end up in using violence to change their circumstances. And often it's because they have felt left out, they have felt excluded, etc. So in order, when you learn when you're doing mediation, the mediation that only looks at feeling good about other people and only looks at superficial things without having deep work addressing structural issues actually is not work that's actually going to survive. So the next thing then I want to talk a little bit about is the whole question of truth, because we all are very confused about truth at the moment. I look at Fox News, I look at One News America, I look at CNN, and it is extraordinary how different people can see truth. And the reason for that is, the reason we believe in certain things is because we feel more safe doing it. You know, many of us are very passionately committed to our own group, and for good reasons, because we don't want to be thrown out of our own group, we like the safety of it, etc. And therefore, we don't feel the empathy for that group that we would need often to deal with in terms of conflict. So it's important to remember that the whole question of how we bring people together and get them to talk with each other has to understand those power differences. The other thing that's often confusing for us is rationality and memories. How can people remember things so differently? And I often say that one of the things to remember is, if you have a partner, you will often remember, when you're in an argument, just the things you want to remember. So what starts with "you never do the dishes," or "you didn't do the dishes tonight," goes to "you never do the dishes," and even when I met you, you never did the dishes. And because you're bringing up in your memory all the arguments that you need to actually win your argument. And a lot of the history in our field of conflict is similar. We're actually using our history of 1400 years ago, 1000 years ago, 600 years ago to actually bolster our arguments. But the thing is that, of course, the other group does not understand that. It is often listening to a different memory, as it were, in terms of their needs. And this is because we need to belong. We need to be certain about our identity. We need to make sure that we're safe, that we're not going to be excluded. And therefore, I think the important thing to remember is that we're not very good at understanding others and making the case for what we believe, because of the emotions we have often about our own work. And where that's important, I'd say we shouldn't ask why people change their minds, but rather, what will they lose by changing their minds? So what will people lose if they change their minds? And if you're to listen to one thing today, it's to recognize that most people need to belong more than they need to be right. Now, just a few other things in terms of reckoning in terms of your own work. Very hard to say to make arguments with people who are really belonging to a group, and they're going to lose a lot if they actually leave that particular group. I could go through this, and I hope that actually somehow you'll get these slides so that you can go over them at your leisure. But I could go through all the things Republican believed about Obama's not being born in the USA, about him not being the true president. It's true in every situation. You have unbelievable beliefs prevailing. I mean, there was a particular group in Northern Ireland who thought they were the lost tribe of Israel, and God had given them the right to actually kill Catholics, so that the Northern Ireland would be a Protestant place and not a Catholic place. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of working with people who are really strongly attached to something like paramilitaries? Remember, it's often much more about what they get from being part of a group, much more about being part of a heroic quest than it is actually about what they believe. Many of the paramilitaries going to ISIL were shown to actually have the dummies for Islam for dummies in their rucksacks, because they actually didn't. It wasn't about paramilitary. It wasn't about ISIL that they were going to argue, or about the theology of Muslimism, or indeed about Christianity or others. So we understand the lure of extremism if we understand the way the mind works, about the brain works, and we understand about the way the hormones work. Now, it's not all bad news. It is good news. And there's a lot of evidence that, you know, as human beings, we have actually been extraordinarily careful with each other in terms of multiplying our ability to cooperate. But the one thing that is making it very difficult today is the whole question of social media. I have a chapter on social media, and it is frightening, because by and large, hateful conspiracies travel so much farther than positive conspiracies. And I know the AFP and others are doing a lot of work on how this actually will change. Now, how this can be changed. So how did this affect my work? Well, one of the things I had to do when I began was to invent a way in which groups could talk to each other in Northern Ireland, because we really felt we hadn't anyway. And into that, we brought a lot of work about questions of feeling. How did you feel about things? What did you learn as children? What did you feel then, etc., etc. And it opened up conversations in a way that logical assertions can't. I remember once dealing with a group from Northern Ireland. It was a Protestant group and a Catholic group. The Protestant stood up. There were people who were quite powerful on both sides. And before we'd even introduced ourselves, one of the Protestants stood up and said, "Mary, I don't know why we're here. We know what Catholics want from us in Northern Ireland. They want us to go back home to Scotland, where we came from 300 years ago, and they don't realise we have nowhere to go." And he started to weep. Now that started a conversation with the Catholics about their feeling of insecurity, which had never been known by a group who thought that they had all the power. So a lot of it is about making sure that we get to the feelings behind a lot of what's being spoken about. A lot of it is about understanding that intergroup feelings are problematic. For instance, I remember meeting the Mindanao Liberation Front, and they had a lot of problems within their group, between their own groups. And actually dealing with that is just as important often, because the people you're most afraid of is not the people across from you on the other side, but the people who are actually your own side and who you feel they will criticize you and maybe kill you in some cases for being disloyal. The whole question of mediation, how do you sprinkle that with oxytocin and make opportunities for it? I remember funders are often not keen to fund work that is beyond just the dialogue, but you really need drinking, you need food, you need hammams, you need all sorts of ways in which people can actually break down a lot of the feelings between them and develop their mirror neurons in activating between them. The whole question of being careful about power, and the whole question of diaspora work is important as well. One of the things I know somebody said to me about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they said, if we got a peace agreement in the Middle East, probably the people, the diaspora in the USA probably wouldn't agree with it and would make it even harder for us, because they want something maybe that's more ultimate than the group itself, who's often knowing that in fact the time has come for them to make compromises. Okay, and the final thing then is just the whole question of getting people together, because we often forget about the feelings of the diaspora. The feelings of diaspora are really important, and often peace agreements leave these out. I don't mean the ideas, they're often left out in that, but also the feelings about it. And I've left 10 things there for you to think about, very much realizing anger comes from fear very often. Don't waste your time on fact checking, and find out why they believe what they believe, and also what they lose if they change their mind. Remember the importance of oxytocin in mediation. Know who matters emotionally to the group you're working with, because they're the people who will change, who will affect change in the groups you're interested in. New groups for people to belong to, very important. Remember, we have to belong somewhere. Young men need heroic opportunities. And also the final one is, remember that the better societies we provide, the less likely we are to have problems, because people's instincts are actually in reaction to their environment. And if you have an environment where basically people are treated justly, they have the cost of living provided for, there's some diversity, there's inclusion, you are much, of course, as we know, it's a cliche, much less likely to have conflict. And therefore the whole question, you can't just end your work at the mediation. It's also about what kind of a society are you going to help people move into after you have, as it were, finished with your peace agreement. I've gone through a lot there, but I'm very conscious many of you would not have read the book. As I say, get your librarians to get it if you're interested. It's a really new field. I'm not saying it's the only way to do things. It's an extra thing to add to your repertoire, as it were. And I'll leave it there and see if I can get back to... There we are. Okay, Tim, sorry, I raced through a pile of stuff there.
No. Thank you, Mari. That was just really wonderful. And I will have to applaud you for taking on not just social psychology and neuroscience, but biology, evolutionary psychology, and quite a bit. And to pack all that and to translate it and discern it into a book is really quite a feat. So congratulations. You said a lot there. And one of the maybe first questions I have is, particularly having served in government, having worked at the community level, and being from Northern Ireland. I mean, that whole history and that conflict and the limitations quite well. You touched upon it, but both as a practitioner and a scholar, what was it? And your training is not, from what I understand, in neuroscience or brain and behavioral science. What was it about both the need, the real practical need, in countries in conflict that brain and behavioral science, in your opinion, could offer? What was that initial interest, and why do you think that was important?
Well, I actually can remember it was one of these moments that I think I will never forget. I came across a piece of an experiment. And what it had done is it showed people who felt strongly about some belief. It didn't matter what the belief was, but they felt very strongly about it. And other people came to talk to them and try to argue with them and try to change their mind. And we had them wired up in MFI machines. And what happened was people who believed strongly in certain things, they actually closed down. They actually froze. Their brains froze. So they would not let into them ideas that would challenge the ideas that they had. Now, just think of this. If we think that our work is based on argument and persuading people, and I was appointed as the director with quite a huge budget in terms of affecting change. And if you think it's going to be just through dialogue, then in fact, you are harping up the wrong tree. You're barking up the wrong tree, because argument by itself, as we will know, and I think from my own doctoral work, about 15% of people changed cognitively through cognitive reasons, through really sort of seeing things logically and differently. Other people change through experiences, through emotions, etc. And I think that to leave that out completely, we are just wasting a lot of our effort and time. And I mean, I'm sure many of our listeners would know how many of you didn't speak about Trump when you went home for Christmas or for the New Year, because you realize that by now, talking to your uncles and your aunts or whoever, if they are people who have voted for somebody very different to yourself, and you realize that very often you didn't get anywhere. Now, another really interesting thing is Ireland has changed in two things over the last few years. Astonishing for a Catholic Ireland. So some years ago, we actually had a referendum on gay rights and marriage, equal marriage opportunities. And to the surprise of everyone, it passed without a hitch in Republic of Ireland. And indeed, even the first Taoiseach after that, he himself was gay. Now, remember, a Catholic Ireland. And then there was another vote we took on abortion. And this was even tougher, because just 20 years before, we'd actually have legislation once again condemning abortion. And abortion passed as well. And if you examine what happened to both of those movements, it's very clear what happened. In the first one, when you were talking about gay marriage, it was people, and the older people said it, the older people actually voted even more for gay marriage than many of the younger groups. And what happened was many of their children and grandchildren had introduced them to people who were actually gay or LGBT or who were different. And they actually got to know people who were different, and therefore they couldn't see why they couldn't have equality. And similarly, when the abortion one happened, I noticed that so many of the ways, so much of the radio was filled with stories that were filled with tragedy of people who had who had been knitting needles, terrible stories about abortion. And those feelings, people said, we can't let that happen in our country. Both of those were actually led by emotions, and they were totally against the Catholic Church's teachings, etc. So I'm more and more convinced that we need to take this. And I mean, can we have lived through Trump without realizing that a lot of what people are feeling with Trump is actually it's feeling about Trump? I mean, I'm one of the people who says I think that what happened was, and I have a huge respect for Hillary Clinton, but I think what happened was when she used the word deplorables to talk about a particular group, that group knew that they were already deplored by many people. They knew that they were looked down upon by many people. So would they go and vote for somebody who actually confirmed it openly? And that was all about feeling and how they felt about each other. And Trump didn't make them feel as if they were sort of beyond the pale in terms of class, etc. So I think it's everywhere. Having lived through Trump and Brexit, you realize that the people who are running the game, as it were, are people who can provoke the emotions.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really key point. I mean, we've talked about this in the past, that so much of the field of conflict resolution, mediation, not meditation, as you said earlier, is based not only on the rational actor view of the world, but also the Enlightenment notion that humans are fundamentally reason-based beings.
Yeah.
And that what is emotion, right? What is the unconscious? That's that sort of, weak step child to us that really doesn't count. And one of the most important things I learned from working with brain and behavioral scientists at places like MIT and elsewhere is they would say it's more important to focus on how we think and not what we think, because how we think is so deeply unconscious, to your point. In fact, 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious awareness.
Yeah.
And that fact, as opposed to an emotion, that fact that 90% should lead people to think, well, don't we need to understand what's going on under the hood?
Yeah. And I think also the looking what people do, the behavior of people as opposed to what they say, because there's a lot of evidence that you don't change people's minds first. Actually, the evidence seems to be you change their behavior. And it was fascinating. A piece of research was done in terms of seatbelts, which decades ago they asked a group of people who hated the idea of seatbelts. They were totally against it. They saw it as civil rights negation, etc. And they went back afterwards, a few years later, to say, "How do you still feel the same about seatbelts?" And people said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you didn't want seatbelts." They said, "We did. We always thought seatbelts were a great idea." Because once they got into the behavior, it was going to cost them too much to emotionally come out and say they didn't agree with it. So there are all sorts of ways in which we change. But unfortunately, logic is one of the least useful in many ways.
Have you found both in your academic career at Brandeis and elsewhere, and then also with this book, resistance to the notion that we need to understand the unconscious brain more and how much it shapes our lived experience?
What I have come across is quite a few disconcerted deans and heads of international politics programs, because what they have found is none of their tools can help them explain, particularly the whole question of violent extremism, etc., etc. And they can just about, they're probably delighted they now have negotiation between Putin and the USA, because those are power sort of negotiations. Although I would say a lot of what happened was the emotions of Putin from a decade ago, but they're comfortable with that. But they find themselves, they have no vocabulary. I have noticed more and more beginning to adopt the kind of vocabulary that we might use in social psychology. And there are more social psychologists becoming interested in politics. And I think that actually is helping. But by and large, traditional political departments are finding themselves at sea in terms of what we call the new conflicts, and are just hoping to God. They're a bit like an army always wants to fight the last war. I think national politics departments are wanting to find the war they're used to as well.
Well, to that point, you mentioned the conferences we did at MIT a number of years ago. There was a chair of a very distinguished university political science department, after attending one of the conferences, wrote me an email and said, what I've taken away from these conferences, and I think you attended this one, is that we in political science only look at groups, and we only look at individuals who are leaders, as if leaders are not organic beings. And was really taken that we discount, she said, cognition and emotion in the work of political science. And I read this and I thought, well, what else is there? We either think or we feel, right? So it's to your point. And do you think you are finding, or are you finding, a shift in the academy? Because that has such a long influence down the road for the people they graduate and put into funding positions, government positions, nonprofit organizations, that they're starting to recognize that we need to understand this more.
And I think it's slow work. I think it's beginning. Like GMU now have a neuroscience unit. But one of the problems is that if you have a look through the various peacebuilding programs, conflict resolution programs, and many of them do not have a focus on the question of social psychology, because social psychology, it's a problem of disciplines. Crossing disciplines is just so difficult for many people. And people, don't forget, get their professorships by sticking within their discipline. So getting social psychologists who will actually take it, we do have a few good people, but they're not enough. I would sense that they're not enough. And one of the reasons for writing the book was that I was hoping I could get into the hands of more people, so they could actually say, guys, when you've stopped listening to this and this, take an account of this as well. And this is an addition to the normal work that we do. But I do think, we used to have all sorts of people in our classes in Brandeis, which was wonderful, because, there's so many disciplines that actually have a lot to offer in terms of peace building, but we often are so stuck. Now, if you try to set up a peace building graduate program, you often can't do it unless you go into an international politics program, or you go into a law program, etc. So I think the lack of crossover between disciplines is really sad. And I think that the work that you started, I would reckon that you're known by quite a few people, but not by a lot of the people who are teaching this work in the 160 graduate programs that there are around the world. So I would like to see more people, at the very least, reading some of this kind of work that I've been talking about, and at the very most, I'd like some other people to specialize in it. Because
let me ask let me ask you, Mari, you've done really important work with this book. Have you thought of creating an online course for this book? Because, we find, AFP finds a lot of growing interest, particularly by an emerging generation of students who want to understand this and see the necessity of understanding that if you look at what's been happening in this country with Brexit and many other parts of the world, it's beyond reason. So if it's sort of like you can't make sense of this, science begins to help us make sense of the unconscious.
Actually the book is based on a course that I did in Brandeis. But, when I left, there wasn't a social psychologist to take it up. So in a sense, I felt at least I was leaving something in terms of the social psychology field. One of the problems is that I suspect that some people would feel that they didn't have the background or the knowledge that would they need to teach courses on it. And I felt that this book would somehow give them at least enough to be thinking about in terms of, because a lot of this is about asking questions. It's not necessarily about sort of knowing the details of the genes or the hormones, etc. It's about asking the kinds of questions, is it enough that you just talked about this or that? For instance, when I interviewed people who had changed political sides, they often actually had nowhere that they could go to and often went back to the old politics because the whole question of belonging wasn't understood. So in Northern Ireland, we tried to set up alternative groups that were mixed groups for youth workers, etc. Because you can't go, life is very hard in a society in conflict if you've nowhere to feel safe, nowhere to situate yourself. So it wouldn't be that difficult to do, to actually go back to the course that I've done. But I think, will there be enough people who'd be interested in taking it up? I would hope there would be. We can ask the question.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation the issue of truth, and I wanted to ask you. I recall in Northern Ireland there was a really strong debate over many years about should Northern Ireland have a South African-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Mm-hmm.
And if I recall, one was never really set up.
No.
And if I recall, that part of the challenge was, if you were Catholic of the Irish Republican Sinn Féin tradition, it was, and you're on the quote-unquote liberation side, the thought was, well, whose truth is being told?
Yes.
Are we going to be targeted for the defense of our community and the use of political violence, which they felt was legitimate? And then you had the Ian Paisley side, for example, that what we're dealing with is not armed struggle, but a crime wave over 30 years, right? So you had two very different, views of what this conflict was about. And it struck me that one of the core ways that understanding brain and behavioral science could be helpful is that in a deeply divided societies, there are many truths. And how people process their truth is really what science can help us. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I found the whole question of truth just to be so critical, because it's amazing how one side can sort of, just see the violence of the other side as being so horrific, but not notice that a few days previously they had killed just the same amount, and they justify it as being their right to do that because they saw the truth as one way. I have to say that, I remember meeting the chair of the 9/11 Commission, who was dealing with victims of 9/11. And I remember we were talking about, because we found it's such difficult work because, people, and in South Africa, what they found was, yes, people did want the truth. But on the other hand, when they got the truth, a lot of them then wanted justice. So the whole question of a process that actually takes into account more than just what you find out, who's killed your loved one, and then getting angry about it, and then what happens after that. One of the good things that's happened here is actually that at long last, the Republican groups who are angry about the army and the police casualties, the army who are angry about their people who've been killed by the Republicans, and the loyalists who are angry about being killed by the Republicans and the Republicans by the loyalists, are now actually, believe it or not, working together on justice for all. Now, this means it's a huge process, but at least they are beginning to see that, in fact, there is a different truth for all. And losing your family, losing your whether you're loyalist or army or police or Catholic, the grief is the same. And therefore, they at least have agreed that they will look at the past together. In terms, now it's a huge, long story in terms of getting the truth and the kid that disappeared. But at least they are at that stage, and I think it's the conversations at least have come to that. It's taken almost 20 years to get to that, but I think that's a good place to be.
Well, I want to, before we go to questions that are coming in from the audience, so to speak, virtual audience. David Irvine, who we both knew well, and for the audience, David Irvine was a loyalist / Protestant paramilitary who spent nearly a decade in prison and came out and became one of the most fearful advocates for peace and dialogue and reconciliation. And I remember once at an event, he said terrorists, he was called a terrorist by many, have to come from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And humiliation is a powerful place to come from.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Indeed. Actually, just talking about Davy Irvine is something that our listeners, our participants might be interested in. Davy Irvine was the product of a prison population and a prison management that actually gave education freely to prisoners. Many of our prisoners, particularly the Republican ones, and later some of the loyalist ones like Davy, actually studied for degrees. Some of them did PhDs in prison. And I think it completely changed their mind when they came out, because those who were socialists realized they couldn't shoot working class Protestants. It changed their frameworks. And I sometimes think, for instance, in terms of the prisons in Israel, where so many Palestinians are, if you have a process that actually gives education to prisoners, no matter who they are, inevitably that kind of deep work can actually help change people and change the frameworks. So Davy gave a lot. I mean, it was so sad that he died so early, because he had a capacity to cross the divide like few loyalists did.
Yeah, well, related to that, a number of years ago, I was teaching a course at a local university, and I had Jerry Adams come in from Northern Ireland, who was he'll never admit it, but one of the leaders of IRA / Sinn Féin. And a student asked him, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill, mm-hmm. or they may have tried to kill you, or did kill somebody close to you? And he paused and he said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. Now think of David Irvine saying separately, and there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the class. And actually this exchange 14 years ago put me on the path of looking at brain and behavioral science. Yeah. And this retired neuroscientist came up to me and said, I've been hearing in these classes themes of fear, humiliation, empathy. And he said, there's a lot of brain science behind that. And when I paused and I said, what do you mean brain science? Because I understood some of the social psychology, what I observed, what I experienced. And he said something that relates to dealing with the past. He said, well, speaking as a scientist, he says, we're not rational beings with emotions. Yeah. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities are understood by others as we see ourselves.
Yes. And you see, one of the things I worry about the academics don't like to think that there are unconscious feelings that dictate what they or others do. And it's particularly true among academics, because a lot of their work is, by its nature, is logical. So I think that coming to that feeling is quite hard for some people to understand, that in fact we are fairly frail in terms of our actual logic. And what's happening is the instinctual and the unconscious that's often throwing us. We don't even know the number of people who just get frightened when I have some games that I play with people, and can very easily bring out old prejudices against old groups that people hadn't even remembered they had. And people get very worried when they realize that they actually do have old ideas about groups. And I often have to say, look, remember, it's not what you feel about someone, because the feelings often come from a long time ago from society. It's what you do about those feelings. But right. I think many people are afraid that, and they're desperately seen as prejudiced or whatever, not realizing that, frankly, we all prejudge. So I think it's our own ability, our own trying to actually avoid acknowledging these emotions that is so difficult.
So, Mari, I want to go to a couple of questions that came in. One of them is, are these insights about the human brain applicable across race, ethnicity, gender, geography? And I think I know your answer, but I wanted you're the guest.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In other words, conservatism and liberalism in the widest sense, not in the political sense, they're right through every society, and rightly so. And societies that, as I say, are more, where safety is more predominant, tend to have more conservative people. But that is true actually right across. You do have some variations in terms of the way people see hierarchies and leaders, the hierarchy of leaders. Which I think we often get confused in. I can remember I was supposed to go to Nigeria once and I couldn't go, and a friend of mine went, and apparently the Nigerians, when they saw him, said, oh, thank heavens, a grey head, because a woman with blonde hair would not have had as much merit as a man with grey hair. So I think you do have to recognize that, each context throws up different ways in terms of prejudice, in terms of hierarchy. And I actually have got a chapter on those differences that occur, but they occur right across the board rather than, people are people, and, there's no conflict you can be in where you don't see the worst of people as well as the best of people.
Right. Now, there's another question is, what is your view on the practical implementation of this knowledge? Right. In other words, how do you apply this? Because you offered a lot in terms of looking at everything from how neurons work to hormones to deep-rooted emotions.
Yeah. Okay. I think, think of the practical ways in which we're trying to use this, listening to groups, trying to decipher what groups are about. For instance, if you're doing your analysis, instead of just saying, this country wants this bit of land and the other country wants that bit of land, get a sense of why. What are the feelings about that? Did it happen a long time ago? We're watching now in Serbia and Kosovo, that could fall apart because of the feelings that were about territory and land. So when you're talking about the think piece, when you're doing the think pieces, think about, and what are the emotions behind it? I'm particularly struck in terms of Ukraine and Putin. And Putin, by and large, was sort of ignored so much of the 10 years ago when so much more could have been done. But always think about, what are the emotions of the people? What are the emotions of the leaders? Have we an idea of what they feel about this as well as what they think about it? And I think that all the other really red flag for me is always think of anger as coming from fear in the first instance. It doesn't mean you don't have to, put somebody in jail or whatever to protect other people. But anger very often comes because often something you can't understand, you want to express yourself, etc. And I think going back to what are they afraid of, like that example I gave, and I've come across many such examples, the example that I gave of the Northern Ireland Protestants, who basically, the Northern Ireland Catholics had never understood that they were afraid they would be sent back, that they had nowhere to go, that they would be alone, that they were despised. So we often don't, when we're drawing up the strategy, as it were, I would like to see a thing down the side saying, what are the feelings that actually count here? And I think that actually will help you then when you go into something like mediation. And I think that one of the questions I've got somebody actually who is interested in working on this. There are moments within every within a lot of mediations that I know of, where what has happened, not that people have got different ideas, because my thesis is ideas are not the problem. I have hundreds of ideas for the Middle East, for Northern Ireland, for whatever conflicts there are. It's getting people to go together to pull those drawers apart and find what they can do together. And that means people actually have to be willing to do things together before they go to it, before they look at any of so the moments that occur within many a mediation in Northern Ireland, it was Bertie Ahern as president who had to go to his mother's funeral. And he came back so quickly, the unionists knew that he was really committed. The whole question of Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa, how they met over some sickness within the family. All of these mediations have times that were corridor conversations. And if you talk to many mediators, any international mediators, they will say those corridor conversations, what happens around, and showing the pictures of the family and talking to people and playing football together, etc. These are often the things that break the barriers that people begin to trust. So I think being careful to add those to all our processes is really important as well.
Thank you. And a couple of more quick questions. There's one from somebody, I'll sort of paraphrase a really good question. I am from a very local peace building group in the United States, looking to provide forums to build bridges. And our first forum is on how to talk about the political divide when you have Republicans and Democrats at a very contentious moment. Any advice for how to start from the bottom up? And why don't you start, and I'll just add one thing after that.
Yeah, I mean, I would always start by saying, look, I know we come from different backgrounds, but we have a common agenda. We want to get this done for our community. And I mean, I think starting on things, there's a lot of evidence to show that, and we struggled with this in the beginning. We used to bring people together to talk about being Catholic or Protestant, and often those groups fell apart because, they were they were too direct. But when you got groups to actually work on projects together and ideas together, and then began to come and say, we'd like extra help in talking about difficult issues like policing or paramilitaries or whatever. So often you do have to have some sort of trust building and clarity about the importance of what you're trying to do together. This is why it's very good for people to be doing, whether it's, when you say bridge building, whether it's actually physical bridge building, whether it's setting up things for children in your community, something that actually people can actually do together, because trust can take some time. And so very often just focusing on the differences in the first instance is actually, what you'll discover is a lot of people won't turn up, basically,
Right.
because what they see is on the table is something that's too threatening. They mightn't even acknowledge it themselves. I mean, you know, Sinn Féin, we couldn't get them to come and talk about policing once the peace agreement was signed. And we knew, because they would then have to take into account what had happened to policing during the conflict, how many had been killed, the grief that there was there as well. So people often don't go if it's straight on to a question, but getting them to sort of think of it. But the other thing that's really is really helpful is people who are comfortable with these conversations, because we would find, you know, we had one criteria for our facilitators, and it would be, would both groups invite you back the next time?
Right.
Not just one, but both, because you do need people who are comfortable. Now, it doesn't mean they can't be themselves part of a group. We found actually using what we called co-partial mediators, people from both sides of the community doing mediations together, was actually very effective. So if you can get a Republican and a Democrat who can model or demonstrate their ability to talk about things that need doing in the community, that in itself is also an inclusory process, as it were. So it can be done, but it's best not just to go straight into the differences. It's often best to say, look, we love our communities, we want to do the best for it. Let's see what we can do that we agree on, and then move on from there.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And the one thing I would add is we, as you know, but for the audience, we released a report at Beyond Conflict last year called America's Divided Mind, looking at the psychology that divides us. And I would recommend that to anybody who's particularly looking at doing this work locally, because one of the things our researchers did was look at the role of misperceptions, meta misperceptions, because where science helps us is our brains evolved to be predictive. And one of the key things our brain is doing is asking, what do other people think about me and us?
Yes.
And when we live in silos, like we do at this moment in the United States, we are in that sort of vortex of reinforcing views of the other and ourselves. And then what we found is people misrepresent Democrats, Republicans, how much they like or dislike, how much they perceive to be dehumanized, and how far away they are in big issues by nearly 50%.
And you know, one of the things people sometimes think, this is sort of their people's personalities. But one of the interesting things to recognize is conservatives actually give a lot more to charity. Republicans give a lot more to charity than Democrats. So it doesn't mean they don't care, but they want the caring to be done in a different way. Not the way the Democrats might want it. So you'll often find there's a lot of work being done on values. Some certain values matter more in some communities than others, but they're often very decent values. They are always very worthwhile values. It's just people want to see things differently because of it. And I think that knowing that there's a lot of work being done on this in terms of moral frameworks, knowing that actually helps a lot. Trying to rethink how somebody is saying, so what they're really saying is this. They're not saying they want people to stay poor on the streets. They don't want to do it the way the Democrats want to do it.
Absolutely. Well, one last question from the audience is, what are the hazards of engaging in in-group dialogue? As with people within their identity groups. And if you might want to talk about that briefly.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I can almost guarantee you is if you don't do in-group work, you're not going to have very good, between group work.
Right.
Because if a group hasn't got its own act together in terms of a lot of its ideas, what happens is they begin to display them from the very big, if you're doing, let's imagine this, I've done this with Israelis, Palestinians. So if they haven't actually had a discussion beforehand about what they sort of agree, where they disagree, what happens is they try to prove loyalty to their own particular ways of seeing when they get into the group. And you have that, and you often have, I often actually try and get somebody whom I know will start off a discussion fairly cautiously and warmly and openly, rather than somebody who comes in and says, well, we know what you want and we don't like what you're doing, because that can make the whole group then protect the first speaker, and they feel they have to be loyal. Whereas if you have done, we called it single identity work. And we put a lot of money in Northern Ireland into single identity work, because when groups weren't comfortable with the way they felt, when there was a lot of rivalry, then that rivalry would come out in terms of ultra loyalism towards the other group, which made the between group work much harder.
Right. So one I was just looking, Mari, at some of the chat here and people responding to other questions. One of the things that we at Beyond Conflict over the last decade, and Mari, what you've done with the book, is try to advance this work. Try to get, the field of, peace building, conflict resolution, human rights, mediation to take this very seriously.
Yeah.
At the same time, getting the academy outside of brain and behavioral science to take this seriously. And we're seeing some progress there in political science in particular.
Yeah.
And also governments and institutions. And so looking at some of the questions where people are appropriately saying, how do we implement this? I think we're all collectively still in the nascency of this.
Yeah.
And
I think we will look back on this. I think you're right, Tim. I think it's gathering speed. I'm delighted that it is, because actually it was a difficult place to come from. It doing this work 10, 20 years ago, I think would have been difficult. But I do think it's gathering speed, and I think people are more open to look at the evidence. And I do think that we will be looking back at this in 10 years' time, I hope, just like we're looking back on the AFP and saying, my goodness, AFP, when we started it, was about 6 people. Now there are over 1,000 people attending this conference. I'm hoping that in 10 years' time, we'll look back and that this will be one of the additional strands, one of the normal ways that we sort of add to our repertoire, as it were, for looking at peace building and conflict.
Yeah, and I think I could speak for both of us by saying that we're burdened by an Enlightenment view of the world, that humans are fundamentally reason-based beings. And the irony about the Enlightenment, it was, based on the notion that science as a discipline was emerging, and science will show us that, religion, mythology, emotions are just getting in the way. And yet it's science today that's saying, no, no, no.
Yeah.
It is just the opposite. And so, go ahead.
And one of the things I wanted to finish with it, I don't think there are good people and bad people. There are psychopaths. There are a very small number of psychopaths. I don't think there are good people or bad people. I think there are societies where it's easier for people to be good and societies where it's harder for people to be good. But I think by and large, if you have societies that nurture people, that give them what they and their children need, etc., it's almost bound to have a more peaceful society. So in effect, it's not as if I wouldn't have wanted people in my class there because they felt they were better than others. I think we're better than others if we've never been put in a situation where we didn't have to take up a gun or a knife to protect our children. I think that's what the reality is. And I hope that with that, we can recognize, we can create a world that is so much different and better in terms of capacity for people.
Yeah, amen. And I'd like to mention my very distinguished colleague and friend who unfortunately passed away, Emile Bruneau.
I know.
And Emile convinced me a number of years ago, when I started looking at what we can learn from brain and behavioral science, his questions to me were, do you know the psychological processes, the mechanisms in the brain and the neural processes that are engaged in peace building, dialogue work, reconciliation? Yeah. And I joked, I said, you sound like a funder. How do you know you're having an impact? And his point was, if you're doing work that takes years of contact, years of engagement, if you actually knew the psychological processes that were engaged to either advance a positive change or prevent it, you could take a 3-year program and maybe turn it into 9 months or 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the power of this. So from a funder point of view, it's not just like this is an important emerging field. If the billions of dollars that are spent just in peace building work around the world, and we all struggle with intractable conflict, fragile peace agreements. If we actually understood what was going on under our heads, in our heads, under our hood, I think from a purely practical point of view, we will become much more efficient with resources and the saving and protecting of lives.
And I think that's echoed in the UNDP did a launch for my book, and they actually are really taking behavioral sciences very carefully. They would know about your work, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, so those barriers are beginning to fall. Those barriers, I think we, as I say, hopefully we're looking at a very productive 10 years ahead of it when your work will continue to develop. Others who follow will continue to develop, and we'll just become the norm, hopefully. And hopefully, as you say, a norm that can shorten the difficulties of the processes that we have.
Yeah, well, this book made a huge contribution. As somebody who's watched you develop this over the last several years, I'm excited. And I would say to everybody who's listening and the questions, I would look at this book and that Mari created. I would also look at the Beyond Conflict website, the America's Divided Mind report. There are a bunch of questions about what can we do to implement. Our colleagues within Beyond Conflict and working at UPenn, NYU, MIT, Harvard, and elsewhere, we've been working with an emerging generation of brain and behavioral scientists, designing interventions, doing research for the purpose of translation. So I would recommend, I think Mari and I would say to the emerging generation, embrace this, learn this, and this is the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for starting it. I'm so grateful.
It's mutual. All right. I think we're at the bewitching hour. And Mari, is there anything final you want to add?
No, I mean, I'm conscious. I always feel conscious that academic books are slightly expensive. They are cheaper through the publishers, but get your librarians to buy it and share it out among yourselves, etc. It'll be great to see if any of you are interested in sort of pursuing it. I'm here. I'm available to listen. If I can help in any way, just let me.
Right. And there's so much we can learn from the people out there in the world.
Absolutely.
Last thing Emil would say is conflict-informed science and science-informed conflict.
And we miss him so much. It was such
absolutely
custom.
Well, thank you, Mari, again. Thanks,
thank you,
Liz and AFP, and thank you for all checking in.
And enjoy the rest of the conference, folks. It's been an amazing process. Take care. Bye-bye.